Welcome back to Analysis, where we've been discussing the reconciliation agreement between Fatah and Hamas in Palestine. For this part of the show, we're joined in the studio by Nazim Ahmed, who's a senior researcher at the Palestine Return Centre, and on the line by Professor Yossi Meckelberg, an associate fellow of the Middle East and North African programme at Chatham House. Welcome to you all. Nazim, you've come on at half-time as a substitute, as I'm sure many commentators over the next few weeks will be saying. So tell us, what do you think the international significance of this is? Well, why have in particular, why have the Americans broken ranks?
Well, usually it's the Americans and the Israelis on one side and the international community on the other side. And on this occasion, of course, the Americans and the rest of the world is on one side, and Israel is isolated on one side. And partly because I think everyone knows the two-state solution has to go through the road of Palestinian reconciliation. There's no other way. Israel, over the years, has consistently maintained the position that which Palestinian are we talking to? There is no Palestinian Authority. So I think these Palestinians, with this reconciliation, have shown the international community they are one, they are united, and if there is to be a two-state solution, which everyone in the world wants, the Europeans, the Americans, because that is the only political card on the table at the moment, although realistically it might be something else, but politically that's the only card on the table. And Israel would be foolish to actually undermine that project, that proposal. So the Americans are on board because it is the only card on the table, and there is no other solution other than the two-state solution, and that is why I think you have international unanimous agreement on this, and they're supporting this financially and, of course, politically in every way.
Okay, Professor Meckelberg, do you think? I guess if I can slightly put words in Nazim's mouth, he's saying that one aspect of this is to rescue a two-state solution, which has almost fallen into disrepute in the past 10 or 20 years.
Yeah, I think first we have to remember that this is a government of technocrats supported by the Fatah and the Hamas, and not a government that the Hamas actually sitting around the table. But yes, it's at the end of the day, the Hamas represent a substantial number within the Palestinian population. The one election quite a long time ago, they represent part of what the Palestinian society is, and the division within the Palestinian society was artificial in the sense that they can't be considered as a serious negotiator unless they're united, and Israel doesn't like it. And I understand some of the apprehension from what the Hamas stood for in the past and even in the present, some of them. But this is part of maybe the maturity of the conflict, the maturity of the relationship. And if the room is created, the space is created also for the Hamas to change and also for Israel to change in this sense, negotiation can be more serious about a two-state solution. One thing which I think is important to remember, that if the Hamas is joining a government, supporting a government that accepts the conditions of the quartet, implicitly they accept the three conditions that's set to them, unless they say otherwise, and on the basis of that, they become part of the peace process.
Okay, so Dr. Barghouti, I hope that we're through to you now. So is this, in a way, as I think Paul was suggesting in the studio at the end of part one, is this an aspect of the weakening of Hamas? Hello.
This is a factor. Definitely it's a factor, and the regional changes are also an important factor. Especially what happens in Syria and in Egypt. These are factors, but they're not the only factors. Fatah itself also has a problem with the fact that negotiations have failed. And both parties have a problem with the fact that the Palestinian public is angry at both of them and angry at this continuous division. But the most important factor probably has been that both Hamas and Fatah realized they were fighting, or they are fighting, over an authority without authority. And instead of fighting over left-outs of an authority under occupation, it's better to unify and end the occupation. And I think to many of them, the authority itself has become a burden more than a privilege. So this is an important issue to understand why now this is happening. But I want here to respond to one particular point about the quartet conditions. It's really very strange that Palestinian parties are asked to accept quartet conditions while Israel itself is not respecting them, and Israel itself did not accept them. They accepted them with 14 different reservations, and practically Israel did not implement any of that, any of the quartet principles. So why Palestinian parties are singled out to have to accept the quartet conditions when Israeli parties are not asked to do that, and even although the Palestinian Authority and the PLO is accepting the quartet principles, the Israeli government is not. So in my opinion, there is a very serious problem here of double standard, and the fact that it has been repeated so many times does not mean that it is proper or correct.
Okay, Paul, is this then, as the picture's emerging in this discussion, it's almost like a kind of circle of weaknesses. Hamas is weakened, as you say, because of the changes in Egypt. That brings about the possibility of the reconciliation, but Israel is isolated because of the shift in American foreign policy, and the Americans don't seem to have the purchase that perhaps they've had in the past. Is that an accurate kind of picture of that?
Sadly, I think, yes, you're very close to the truth, and that's particularly the case if we're talking about the international arena and the American position on this. Take the fact that the American president went and provided a foreign policy review at West Point a week ago, if not slightly longer, and everybody who was listening to this noted that he didn't mention Israel-Palestine at all. Recognize that when the Israelis were kind of expecting that the Americans would be a little less forthcoming in even tacit support for the reconciliation government the Palestinians have created. In fact, as we saw in the package before, they used words like working with. We'll keep an eye on everything, but we're ready to work with. Does that mean that the American administration is weak in this situation? To many observers, that does seem to be the case. But once again, we look at long games. The American presidency is now running into its last term. The Israeli prime minister, who believes he can win the next election, and I have question marks about that, kind of hopes that he will outlast Obama, and then he'll have a friend in the White House to whom he doesn't have to come to the Senate to insult again. He can just come and be friends, and everything will be hunky-dory. That's a long road to go between now and November of next year. But you're right, there are weaknesses. And let's not forget, overall, when looking at the Israeli picture, Bibi Netanyahu is weak himself. These are not the actions of a statesman, a strong man. These are the actions, as have been said, not by me but others, of a man who's hiding behind the machismo of an Israeli leader, where in fact a lot of what he's doing is cowardly.
Martin, I mean, you were talking before the break about the role of the Europeans here. Now, okay, we've talked of the kind of triangular forces between the Palestinians themselves, the Americans and the Israelis. Fit the role of the Europeans into this picture for us.
Well, I've always thought that the Americans, even if Obama wanted to be the person who reached the peace agreement, he can't, because Congress is simply so strongly on the Israeli side that there was no possibility. And although, of course, Kerry tried very hard in the talks, I thought they were doomed to failure. The Europeans have the will, I think, to make a difference, and they have the power. The trouble is they don't have the unity. Most of the things that the Europeans could do to affect the situation would require unanimity. All 28 members of the European Union voting together, and that happens very, very rarely. However, I think the leading members of the European Union, Britain, France, Germany, Spain, etc., they're in a very strong position, the strongest position anyway, to take a lead on this. And they need to get the ball rolling. I mean, some interesting steps have been taken by the European Union about refusing to make agreements with Israel that include the settlements, and taking action on labelling so that the Israelis can't pass settlement goods off as Israeli. But these are very small steps. They need bigger steps now to put real pressure on the Israelis, particularly on the settlement issue, and they could do it. But I'm not convinced that the European Union itself is going to be the agent to change. I think, surprising as it may sound, the United Kingdom is the country best placed to take the lead on this. Whether William Hague has got the resolve to do it, I don't know. In the past, his excuse has always been, I'll wait for the Americans, or we can't do anything during the peace talks, or well, we don't believe in sanctions. But I mean, all of these things are irrelevant now.
Okay.
They have to think again, they have to have a plan B, and it should be William Hague and some of the other Europeans that come out with a plan B that involves strong pressure on Israel to get them to talk seriously with the Palestinians.
Right. Professor Meckelberg, do you think that's likely? Do you think the Europeans can emerge as a kind of leading edge of pressure on the Israelis?
I doubt it. I think if the European, it's not only about pressure, it's really being engaged with the peace process and making their stand very clear. And they don't, because the Europeans usually on issues of foreign affairs are not clear almost on any issue, let alone following the recent elections. I think Europe will be preoccupied with other issues and won't find either the time or the energy to deal with the peace process, especially when, you see, it doesn't look like a winner. It looks like something that whoever touched the peace process ends in a failure. John Kerry put 9 months and more out of this term, and look what happened. And the European Union, especially with division, the lack of unity within the European Union, probably will think whether it's worth their while, what kind of cross pressure will take place, and especially if they will make a move, for instance, putting pressure on Israel through trade, through agreement, and others, what will be the backlash with certain countries.
Okay. Nazim, what do you reckon?
I don't think we should undermine the EU totally. I mean, it is, after all, paying for Israeli occupation. So one of the reasons why Israel has to actually come on board is because it knows that if the EU was to stop its funding, if America was to stop its funding, it has to actually look after Palestinians within the West Bank. So it's not totally, it's not a card which they don't have. They have a card to play if they wanted to, which is if they stopped paying the authority, then Israel has to actually fork out for the occupation. But Israel also has mastered the ability to actually make a good situation out of bad. So I think in the long term, what you will see, even if it was to agree and accept that the Palestinian Authority will have Hamas on board, in the long term, it probably will use that to say, look, we've conceded and accepted Hamas within the Palestinian Authority. Now give us something in return within the peace process. So although the two are totally not related at all, but Israel, I think, has this ability and this capacity to actually use this and in the future and say, we've conceded on something, we've allowed Hamas on board, now you concede something on the peace process. So it will, in the long term, may actually use that to its strength. But the EU, as I said, it still has a card to play. It is funding the occupation, and as long as it's funding the occupation, it is a player, not just a pair, as people say.
Mustafa Barghouti, how do you read the Europeans' role in this?
I think the Europeans have made good steps so far in two directions. One is accepting the unity government and the reconciliation agreement, and this did not happen just by itself. We did make a lot of efforts with different foreign ministers in Europe to prepare them for accepting this unity agreement, and we're glad that Europe is responding positively. On the other hand, the European Union is also playing a very important role through the regulation that it has imposed on its relationship with Israel, restricting and rejecting any agreement in terms of cooperation that deals with occupied territories, including, by the way, East Jerusalem, something that Australia has to know about and reconsider its own positions regarding it. I believe that there is still very big potential on the side of Europe to move forward more. Israel will not change its policy because so far the occupation has been profitable to Israel. And Israel will not, this Israeli government, the existing majority of the Israeli public is accepting the status quo because it's beneficiary to them. What we want from Europe is more than just diplomatic stance. What we need is really bigger growth of the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign in a similar way to what has happened in the case of South African apartheid system, because Israeli occupation has become really a true apartheid, even a much worse apartheid than the one that prevailed in South Africa. I know it's a long way, but I know also that the support to Palestinian cause at the public level in many countries is much bigger than the positions of the governments in these countries. And I believe that I personally don't think there is any hope for negotiation. As long as there isn't sufficient pressure on Israel, a serious pressure, which we still don't see neither from the United States or Europe, there will be no movement. And Israel is just declaring one settlement actions after the other. During the last week, they've announced more than 3,800 new settlement activity blocks. And before that, 14,000 during the time of negotiations. These settlements are killing the possibility of two-state solution. So in my opinion, without punitive actions, without sanction actions against Israel, Israeli public will not change its position.
Okay. Professor Meckelberg, there's the rub, isn't it? I mean, we touched on it in the first part of the programme. Really, the settlements are the thing, the red button that Israel can always press, which can explode any peace process, aren't they?
Yeah, well, I think at the end of the day, this expansion of settlement is self-defeating for Israel. I disagree with my previous speaker that that the situation worse than apartheid in South Africa. This is not accurate, but the situation is very bad, and the occupation is wrong and unsustainable, and the expansion of settlement can be justified politically or morally. And the thing that Israel is there make their situation worse and worse in the eyes of public opinion around the world. And that's probably will lead for an action at one point or another. Again, my question if either the European Union or the United States are willing or capable, for different reasons, to take any actions. But every time that Israel responds to failure in peace negotiations or to an action like a unity government, which is actually a positive move by expanding settlement, it hampers Israel, and the current Israeli government is one that causes long-term damage not only to the peace process and to Palestinians, but I think to the future and well-being of Israel itself.
Paul, let's talk a little bit more about something that you touched on before, and that's the situation in Egypt and its relationship to what's happened in Palestine. Now, this isn't actually the first unity process. There was a unity process when the Egyptian revolution was, so to say, in the ascendant, and when the Muslim Brotherhood were in the ascendant. So that was a unity process born of an increase in influence of the Egyptian revolution and of the Brotherhood. This is a unity process, you were suggesting earlier, born of the decline of that influence. Do you think there's another twist in the road, or there certainly possibly is another twist in the road in the Egyptian revolution, which could also begin then to affect this?
Well, look, Al-Sisi is elected after Tahrir Square, where those in the square wanted something other than what they've got now that he's been elected. One thing is clear, certainly to Israeli eyes, and that is here is another dependable Egyptian ally who will do two things. He will continue to suppress the Muslim Brotherhood, which means pressure on Hamas. He will also continue to do something else that we haven't talked about. It's not always germane to these discussions, which is the situation in Sinai, which has been a jumping-off point for a whole bunch of terrorist attacks against Israel and seemed to have been a heartland for a certain type of jihadist Islamic terrorism. So when you read that one of the first people to call al-Sisi and congratulate him on winning the election and being inaugurated is Bibi Netanyahu, you can bet your bottom dollar that these two guys have something in common when it comes to these circumstances. But these circumstances also include something that Egypt has a vested interest in, which is seeing that Gaza is no longer something in uproar, something which is potentially weak and can constantly demand its attention. So he's kind of caught in the glare of his own headlights, El-Sisi. I think he would like to see him find a way to nurture these talks, this reconciliation. I'm not quite sure whether this is the time for him to concentrate on it.
What do you remember that dimension to it, Martin? The Egyptian dimension?
Well, yes, well, I think we ought to give credit to Hamas because although they were under enormous pressure and they had very few options, nevertheless, they showed some discipline to agree finally to reconciliation, and hopefully they did it because they put the interests of Palestine ahead of the interests of their party. I think it's very important to remember that in these situations, the parties are both national liberation movements and parties. And for for achieving independence, you need unity, but once you've achieved independence, you will need different political parties. So, in a sense, both Fatah and Hamas have to exercise this bit of discipline to work together until they achieve independence as a sovereign country. After that, of course, they will represent, as you said in the introduction, they have disagreements, and so they should. But in the meantime, for the moment, they should work together. And I think actually, not only should they both support the interim technocratic government, but after the election, they should have a coalition government, because in order to achieve that independence, they really need to show unity, even though, of course, they represent very different strands within the Palestinian politics.
So, Nazim, are we going to get that far? Is it going to stick that far?
Well, I just want to make one point about the revolution, first of all. I don't think you've seen in history where you've had a full revolution, and revolutions usually change with the regime, but here you've gone full cycle, come back to what it was exactly 2 years ago, and you've never seen that. And of course the Palestinians, at one point you thought they're in a much better position, as you mentioned, but now they've come off in a much weaker position. And part of there has always been this idea that the Gazan population of Gaza would somehow be incorporated with Egypt as a model there. And I think Sisi, in a sense, would never want that. Maybe the Brotherhood could have one time considered, but the Sisi, I don't think, would ever accept 1.7 million Palestinians to actually be part of Gaza. So his strategic thinking is probably, we want a two-state solution to work, and I will ensure that it will work by bringing the Palestinians together. And as I said right at the beginning, the road to a two-state solution, which in my opinion is dead and buried, but the road to a two-state solution is through Palestinian reconciliation. So this game still has to continue and be played by major regimes in the Middle East and around the world. So that's the only game in town, and Sisi is trying his best to actually make it work.
Okay.
Which probably won't.
Well, that's what we're going to have to leave the discussion, because we've come to the end of this episode of Analysis. I'd like to thank my guests and, of course, you at home for watching. So please do tune in again for future discussions, and don't forget that you can keep up with the discussion by following us on Twitter at the address below, or by following the Islam Channel Current Affairs team on Facebook. Until next time, thank you and good night.